Welcome everyone to the launch of the 2023 Freedom and Prosperity Indexes. My name is Anna Gavel. I'm managing editor of Devex, which covers global development issues. Just to give you some brief background on our event today. So the Freedom and Prosperity Center at the Atlantic Center aims to increase the well-being of people, especially poor and marginalized in developing countries, through database research on the relationship between prosperity and economic, political, and legal freedoms. It seeks to answer questions like, do countries need freedom to achieve prosperity? And do democracies or autocracies have better answers to the aspirations of people around the world? Key to answering these questions is the Freedom and Prosperity Indexes that has surveyed nearly every country in the world, which we'll be discussing later today. First, though, I'd like to introduce a background on two of our panelists. We have Dan Negrea, who's the Senior Director of the Freedom and Prosperity Center. He was the State Department's Special Representative for Commercial and Business Affairs between 2019 and 2021. In that capacity, he led the Deal Team initiative, which promotes business relations between U.S. and foreign companies around the world. He was also a member of the Secretary of State's Policy Planning Office between 2018 and 2019, where he was responsible for the economic portfolio. For 3 decades before that, he held leadership positions in Wall Street firms, raising over $15 billion in financing in the United States and abroad, mostly for middle market companies. He defected from communist Romania, where he had been an official with the Ministry of Finance and was involved in negotiating government loans with the World Bank and International Monetary Fund. We also today have Joseph Lemoyne, who is the Deputy Director of the Freedom and Prosperity Center. Previously, he was a private sector specialist at the World Bank, where he advised governments on policy reforms that helped boost entrepreneurship and shared prosperity, primarily in Francophone Africa and the Middle East. Mr. Lemoyne also participated in and led the creation of development indicators on business climate, good regulatory practices, women's entrepreneurship, and government transparency. Now, before we begin our discussion, I'm going to pass it over to a video that will give you a recap of the Freedom and Prosperity Indexes.
We all want prosperity for families, communities, countries, and for the world. We want people to not only have food and shelter, but a good standard of living, education, healthcare, a fair society, and a clean environment. That's what we mean by prosperity. But what is the surest path to prosperity? Academics, policymakers, and citizens have been debating this matter for a very long time. Some say that free societies produce the best outcomes by unleashing the creativity and talent of individual citizens. Others say that focusing on the individual is too chaotic and ultimately inefficient, that a strong central authority produces the best results. The Freedom and Prosperity Center at the Atlantic Council, a think tank in Washington, D.C., contributes facts and figures to this debate through our annual Freedom and Prosperity Indexes. We built a Freedom Index to measure economic, political, and legal freedom in 164 countries. Each score reflects measurements of several indicators. Together, they create a comprehensive and unique measurement of freedom. We also built a Prosperity Index to measure income, health, education, the environment, treatment of minorities, and inequality in the same 164 countries. A prosperous society should be judged on more than just income per capita. Our index gives us a holistic view of prosperity. In the Freedom Index, we rank countries into 4 tiers based on their total scores: free, mostly unfree, and unfree. In the Prosperity Index, we rank countries as prosperous, mostly unprosperous, and unprosperous. We have 3 key takeaways from the resulting data. Our first takeaway is that there is a strong correlation between our freedom and prosperity scores. We show a 0.8 correlation between a country's scores in the 2 indexes. This means high values for freedom are associated with high values for prosperity, and low values for freedom are associated with low values for prosperity. On average, the freer the country, the higher it will score in all 6 measures of prosperity. The income scores show that free countries are far and away the richest. People born in free countries are also healthier and live substantially longer. Citizens of freer countries have access to better education and spend more time learning. The environment scores indicate that freer countries have cleaner environments. Unfree societies are less equal. Wealth is more unevenly distributed among citizens. And unsurprisingly, unfree countries are also less tolerant. This leads to our second takeaway. Evidence suggests that freedom contributes to prosperity. We examined for our sample of 164 countries the correlation between changes in freedom and changes in prosperity over time. If freedom is really driving prosperity, an improvement in freedom would be strongly associated with an improvement in prosperity. And that is exactly what we find. Countries that increased their freedoms the most are the ones where prosperity increased the most. Peru and Venezuela are prime examples. In 1995, Venezuela was a freer country than Peru. But at the turn of the century, Peru made a clear turn towards freedom. It is one of the top improvers in our data. In contrast, Venezuela shows the largest decrease in freedom of all the countries we cover. Venezuela had a higher prosperity score than Peru in 1995, but by 2022, the 2 countries had switched positions. Our third takeaway is that autocracies generally fail to deliver prosperity for their people, while free countries succeed. Of the 30 countries ranked at the top of our freedom rankings, 27 are in the top category of our prosperity index, and 3 are in the next highest category. None are in the bottom 2 categories of prosperity. Of the 30 countries ranked at the bottom of our freedom index, 11 are in the lowest category of our prosperity index, 17 are in the next lowest category, and just 2 in the mostly prosperous category. None are in the top prosperity category. Our indexes demonstrate that there is a strong relationship between freedom and prosperity, and we have reason to believe that improvements in freedom will, over time, lead to greater and more durable prosperity. Please visit the website for the Atlantic Council's Freedom and Prosperity Indexes. The interactive capabilities of the website allow you to compare detailed data across time for countries and regions. All our indexes, information, and our annual report can be downloaded for further analysis.
Well, Dan, let's start with you. There are lots of indexes out there, including many that measure freedom. What makes this one unique?
Yeah, so thank you. This is really probably the most important question. Why is humanity better off with these indexes than before the indexes? So there is no other freedom index like ours. There are some excellent economic freedom indexes. Heritage has one, Fraser has one. There is a political freedom index that we all know and love, the Freedom House Index that we refer to, and of course, the Justice Project has a legal freedom index. We put it all together, and we have sub-indexes for each of these dimensions of freedom, economic, political, and legal, for better analysis. So having a comprehensive freedom index with these sub-indexes is unique. The prosperity index is also unique in the sense that other measurements of prosperity, like the Human Development Index of the World Bank or of the United Nations, measure just 3 dimensions. GDP, which is the material wealth, education, and health. But we go beyond that and also measure inequality, the environment, and the treatment of minorities, which we measure with religious freedom. But probably most importantly, what is unique about us is the purpose behind creating these indexes by having them as companion indexes, a freedom index and the prosperity index, we can study the interrelationship between the two. Because we want to see if we are right in a premise that we want to explore, which is that countries that have more freedom also have more prosperity. So this is what sets us apart.
Joseph, given how comprehensive these indexes are, they require a lot of data. Can you talk a bit about how this data was compiled?
Yes. So you saw it in the video. We have 164 countries and 28 years of data from 1995 to 2022. We do not collect the data. We use data from institutions that are reputable, then the data that has been used and that is approved by the international community. That includes the World Bank, the UN, VDEM, the World Inequality Database, the World Governance Indicators, among others. So we have 10 sources that we primarily use. And like Dan was saying, we have different indicators. So total would be 19 indicators from 10 sources for a total of 100,000 data points. And that goes back to why are we doing this? Goes back to what Dan was saying, is having this data, having this time coverage and this and having data for every single country for every single year allow us to do this research, to actually look at how freedom and prosperity interact.
Dan, data is a great thing, but how can we use this in real life?
Well, the important thing to understand is that one of the things that we can do is make the case that authoritarian countries are not delivering for their people. It is one of the big debates in our time, given that China and Russia claim to have a development model that other countries should follow. So we did an analysis for that, and we can show that countries that were comparable to both China and Russia developed faster when they chose freedom rather than the countries that were authoritarian. But in general, the way we want to make the case is by engaging with both people in the civil society, think tanks in developing countries that want to go to their governments and make the case that their countries should have more freedom in order to achieve more prosperity. And for that, we teamed up with the Atlas Network, and we give something that we call the reform grants. So we give money to think tanks that go to their governments and make the case. But we work also with people in government who are interested in understanding the levers that they can use to improve the lot of their people and give them benchmarks by using our analysis.
Now, Joseph, 2012 seems to stand out as a pivotal year. What happened in that year?
Yeah, so we do all this work, and you might ask, why should we care, right? Well, today, if you look at our data, freedom is declining, right? So there's a lot of conversation about the democratic backsliding and so on. And by having this disaggregated data, we can actually pin it down to what is happening. So from 1995 to 2012, both freedom and prosperity were going up. In 2012, freedom started to decline. Because we have those sub-indexes, we can go into what's happening. Economic freedom is still going up all the way to COVID, and then it's declining for the reason that we know. But it was political freedom and legal freedom, the rule of law, that is declining. And if you look at prosperity, you saw in the video that freedom and prosperity interact. From 1995 to 2012, prosperity is almost a straight line. And it's a growth of about 0.4 per year in points. We have a scale from 0 to 100, so 0.4 points per year. Consistent growth. And starting 2012, it flattens, right? And with COVID, it starts to decline. So really, there is a sense of urgency. I mean, it's been going on for 10 years, but it is happening. And what I found fascinating in this data, because we have the entire world, we can see that it's not a phenomenon that is specific to a certain region or a certain group of countries. There are countries everywhere where democracy and freedom is collapsing in every single region. Venezuela is, easy example in Latin America, but we have example in Thailand, we have example Russia, Belarus, Hungary are among the biggest declines. In Africa, we have Mali and the Republic of the Congo. And so it's really something that is global in every single region, and which makes it hard to pin down the core reason, but makes it even more fascinating to me.
Yeah. Dan, you talked about China and Russia, and of course they are presenting alternative models to Western democracies. So let's dig a bit deeper, and how did they fare in the indexes?
Yeah, so we did this analysis, and it's really fascinating because we found parallels between the two. So in the case of Russia, we have the benefit of an unusual situation in social sciences where we can do a social experiment. So in physics or in chemistry, you can have a closed environment and you can analyze something where you isolate it from other. It's rare to have it in social sciences, but in the case of Russia and the Baltics, they were all part of the Soviet Union. They were all communist countries. They had no political freedom. They had no economic freedom. After the collapse of the Soviet Union, Russia, on the one hand, and the Baltics, on the other hand, chose different paths in terms of their prosperity. And when we looked at where they were on the prosperity spectrum, Russia was ahead in 1995. The Soviet Union fell apart in 1991. Russia was ahead about 10% compared to the Baltics in 1991. But by 2022, they were behind by 30%. This is just looking at GDP per capita. Looking at our prosperity index, which is broader, the same picture. They were ahead, and then they fell behind. And then the question is why? In the prosperity index, the Baltics were up by 1.2 times. And then the question is why? When you look at our freedom index, the Baltics are ahead of Russia by 2 times. So the score in 22 for the Baltics was about 80, and the score for Russia was about 40. And Russia, their freedom score declined between 95 and 22 by 30%. And it's so interesting then to look at China because you see something very similar. Their freedom score also is about half of the score for the countries that we picked as a comparison, which is South Korea and Taiwan. And then the prosperity score is also ahead for South Korea and Taiwan. So we see in both of these cases countries that started from a similar point. In the case of South Korea and Taiwan and the People's Republic of China after the Second World War, they were comparably poor. And also they were all dictatorships. So South Korea and Taiwan were military dictatorships, but they had economic freedom, and China was a communist dictatorship. They had neither. So then they developed differently. South Korea and Taiwan have a GNI per capita, which is twice that of China. And South Korea and Taiwan escaped the middle income trap, meaning they moved from middle income to high income countries, while China did not. So in looking at these two countries, Russia and the People's Republic of China, who claim that they are a model for development, I'm inspired. I'm remembering the ad that we had in the 90s, where these 3 elderly ladies asked, "Where is the beef?" So they said, "Be like us." Well, why should we be like you? You are not performing compared with countries that choose freedom.
Mm-hmm. And if I may complement what Dan is saying is, our data, by disaggregating economic freedom, political freedom, and legal freedom, we can see how those 3 interact and see how these lead to prosperity. And the recipe that works the best is the three of them together, right? And in the case of Taiwan and South Korea, they had legal freedom, the rule of law, they had economic freedom, and then they implemented political freedom and democracy, and that's what led them to the place where they are today. And if you look at what China has been achieving, which is, taking people out of poverty more than any country in history, but then this switch, we don't see this switch in the data. Actually, if you look at when Xi Jinping took office, political freedom is declining as he's taking a grip on the country, and which is, we think unfortunate because maybe there was a missed opportunity here.
Mm-hmm. Now, Joseph, staying with you, beyond China and Russia, you had 162 other countries. Which countries made big moves up and down over the last 28 years, and what were some of the consequences of that?
So I like to compare things to make them interesting. The biggest freedom decliner is Venezuela, right? Mm-hmm. And we saw in the video that in 1995, Venezuela was far more free and far more prosperous than Peru. And Peru, who has its struggles now, freedom is declining now, but in the late 90s and early 2000s, implemented pro-democracy, pro-markets reforms that actually led them to cross paths with Venezuela. And despite being a country with far less natural resources, today they flip position and Peru is much more prosperous than what Venezuela is today. But more, what I've found fascinating in the data, so I have good news for you. It's easier to increase prosperity than it is to decline prosperity. And there's actually only a few countries that had a negative change from 1995 to 2022. And the biggest negative change was Syria, and the second one was Venezuela. So in Syria, civil war, and in Venezuela, autocratic, poor governance decision, right? So the impact of declining freedom over time can be, not as bad, but can be similar to that of a civil war.
Mm-hmm. Now, Dan, at Devex, we cover global development issues, and of course that includes civil society and democracy promotion efforts. Can these indexes be used for America's democracy promotion efforts abroad?
So this is an excellent question. The answer is yes, but with several caveats. Mm-hmm. So number one, we are not working with the U.S. government as to promote an American agenda in any way. We don't have money from the U.S. government or anything. We would like to work more with agencies. We recently had a meeting with the USAID, the U.S. Agency for International Development. But we have not designed them to promote anything in the agenda of the U.S. government. Having said that, we are at an extraordinary moment in time, and I think that our indexes and the report that Joseph and I authored can be an excellent tool to make the case, not just for the United States, but for the free world in general, towards a better future for all humanity. And let me elaborate on that. What became very clear after the invasion of Ukraine by Russia is that groups of countries have emerged that are very clearly defined. So you have the group of authoritarian countries, Russia and China and Iran, North Korea. You can put Venezuela, Cuba, where the Chinese are putting spy stations against the United States. So that's one grouping of countries. But then following the Ukraine war, the free world, and by the way, the terminology of the previous Cold War is coming back in fashion. The free world also coalesced very, very strongly, and these are democracies in Europe, but also Japan, South Korea, Australia, New Zealand, and so on. But then there is an entire other group of countries referred to variously as the Global South, which I don't like the term because geography has nothing to do with it. I prefer the term the new non-aligned movement. I also heard the term swing countries that are important countries like India, South Africa, Brazil, Mexico, that are not as strongly opposed to the extraordinary violation of United Nations principles by Russia as the free world countries. And they're taking a position that they want to be non-aligned in many respects. The indexes and our work can help the government of the United States and the people of the United States, as well as the government and the people in the free world in general, to make the case to the countries of the non-aligned movement that more freedom leads to more prosperity, therefore they should increase freedom on their side and also coalesce at opposing aggression everywhere. So it's in this sense that our work can be helpful.
Yeah. And to complement Dan's comment, if you go play around with the data on our website, which I encourage you to do, you can look at the global trend of freedom and prosperity. And so we did a little analysis of those countries that were better off in 1995 than they are today on prosperity. And among those countries that crossed the global trend, meaning that they're missing the train, is Brazil, South Korea, Mexico, and the Philippines. And in all those countries, freedom has been declining or stagnating. So.
Did that come as a surprise to you? I mean, obviously we have Syria under years of civil war, Venezuela under Nicolas Maduro, but were there other countries that kind of stood out or surprised you as the results came in from these indexes?
There is 100,000 data points, and we're only scratching the surface. I guess if I were, we created this framework to test an assumption, and you build it, you do an exercise of testing what you think is the right answer, and it might not be right. But it is pretty spectacular how strong all those links that we found in the data are, how those...
So we had some interesting conversations. For example, colleagues at the Atlantic Council and other think tanks looked at the United States. And they said, well, where is the United States? Quite frankly, we didn't worry about it. So I think it's 17 in prosperity and 11 in, 17 in freedom and 11 in prosperity. I mean, it's free and prosperous.
22, yeah.
And then you can see people who are more on the left, they say, how come it is so high? And people who are on the right say, how come it is so low? And then there are other people who wanted to know where Israel ranked, and they have a position on freedom in Israel, and they wondered why Israel ranks so high in freedom. And the same thing with Singapore. And on Singapore, there is an interesting discussion to be had, which is it's one of the exceptions to the rule that countries that have imperfect freedoms tend not to rank well in terms of prosperity. But the way we define freedom, it's an average between economic freedom, political freedom, and legal freedom. So it is possible that a country, for example, Singapore, will not rank very well in political freedom, but rank very, very well in economic freedom and legal freedom. And when you average the three, the total score for freedom is very high. So that so these are the three countries where we had some conversations.
Yeah.
And if we bring it back to trends and patterns, which I always tend to bring it back to, something that is not a surprise, but I think an encouragement. The indicator that saw the greatest progress by huge margin is women's economic freedom. So over the entire sample, 1995 to 2022, I think it's 18 percentage points increase over the sample. And this is true across all regions. Of course, some started behind than others, but every single region, on looking at the sample, improved women's economic rights. And then another thing that I found encouraging, obviously, for this work, Africa is, this work is extremely important to Africa. We have, the largest growing population across all continents. And the continent, the region, Sub-Saharan Africa, this region is the region where prosperity grew the most. Obviously, this started behind, but it is happening over the sample. And what I think is encouraging, it's also the region that saw the largest growth on freedom. And so we're hopeful that if this continues, if this improvement on freedom is sustained, that will lead to improvement in prosperity in the mid and long term.
Mm-hmm. Now I have a question for each of you. And of course, you've talked about some of the progress and the positives that were made. Being the journalist, I have to look at the critical viewpoint and some of the negatives, I suppose. Now, in the end, I believe only 14% of people live in countries that are fully free and prosperous. So can you go back to some of the silver linings? I want to ask each of you that emerged from this report.
The silver
linings, the good, yes.
Thing. Well, I will go back to this women's economic freedom thing. I think it was really one of the most heartwarming things, and I think it is also one of the most consequential. Because the idea that in a society, 50% of the population don't contribute to the human flourishing in that society because they cannot fully participate in the economic life, is such a huge problem. And when we look at trends, sometimes they are clear, sometimes they're not very clear, sometimes they go up and then they go down. But this one indicator which is in the economic freedom indicator, which is women in business, it's a straight up line. And it's such a great thing to see. It is almost on par, I would say, to the tremendous numbers that we saw of people escaping abject poverty over the past 20 years, people living on less than $2 a day. So it's on an equal scale, the recognition that women should participate. So that was, for me, one of the things that I was most happy about.
And something that I mentioned earlier as well is that it's much harder to decline in prosperity than it is to decline than it is to increase. Like as a species, we tend to live longer and be wealthier under capitalist societies. And I think a good example of this is the score for Russia, where obviously freedom is collapsing. Today they rank at 138 out of 164, but they're still a mostly prosperous country, ranking 63 out of 164. So because in 1995 they were in a very good place, right? It is not looking good, not going in the right direction. But I think that was something that I found interesting, is that you need freedom to move forward, and Russia needs a lot more of that. But if a country goes to a terrible path, there is hope to recover and go back on the right path quickly. So.
Well, on that note, it's always good to have positive perspective. I wanted to open it up to the floor for any questions that we might have. There is a microphone there, and if you could please introduce yourselves. And we also have, it's online, we have online questions if anyone virtually would like to submit a question. I think your mic should be on. Please go ahead.
Kim Betcher, Center for International Private Enterprise. Thank you for the report on these important topics. The trend in women's economic freedom is one that really does jump out in this report and was partly unexpected to me. I've seen many examples of women in business leading and pioneering and doing new things, but other things I look at might not be so promising, like investment in women-owned businesses or the state of women's property rights. So can you elaborate on what are the drivers? What are you picking up in that trend line?
Well, I mean, I don't know how to elaborate. We picked up an index. I think it's from the World Bank,
yeah.
right? And it is, so again, all our indexes cover 164 countries between 1995 and 2022. So what we are always thorough about doing is use data which are consistently provided from the same source with the same methodology, and we trust the work of the World Bank. And we also want to have data that are available for all countries. So for all countries over this period of time, we looked at this one index produced by the World Bank, and we got these results, which are great.
Yeah.
I think one of the things that are important to note, and I think that's where your note of caution comes, in some regions, the slope is much more positive than in other regions. So, for example, in the Middle East, we have a Middle East and North Africa region, the way we divide the world in 7 regions. The progress is less impressive, but it's still a positive slope. In other countries, it's much more impressive.
Yeah, if I can complement so there is no good data on the reality of implementation on laws when it comes to women. So the data that we use, which is Women, Business, and the Law, where my good friends from the World Bank produced this report, is based on laws and regulations. So it's not the practice, it's the regulations. And what we did, we took off all the other components that were measured by the other indicators that we have in the economic freedom sub-index. So what we measure under women's economic freedom is mobility, so ability to move freely, pay, measuring the gender, the wage gap, entrepreneurship, so the constraints that are added when you're a woman, when you want to create a business, and assets, so looking at inheritance and property laws. And I know they actually starting to create a new project that will look at the actual practice, but it's a multi-year endeavor. So right now, the best we could do is to look at the laws and regulations.
Thank you for clarifying.
And we have some virtual questions here. As a scholar, how can I secure funding in order to make use of the fascinating index in my research, especially if I want to study a particular country and might need to travel and gather more data?
Actually, we should direct this question to the gentleman who is at the microphone right now.
No pressure.
No pressure. So we are helping scholars, individual scholars who are in academia, and we are helping think tanks around the world, but with a strong preference for developing countries, in partnership with 2 wonderful organizations. One of them is the Atlas Network, and the CEO of the Atlas Network wants to ask a question. And it's a big accomplishment because he's normally shy and withdrawn, so it will come very unnaturally. But through them, we've given, what, eight grants so far to think tanks in 8 different countries, totaling about $200,000. And then the other wonderful organization is the Acton Institute, and with them, we are giving grants to scholars, individual scholars, who write scholarly papers and publish them, or work with us to help us to produce this. But Brad, maybe you want to elaborate how exactly they can apply to Atlas on the grants that we produce together.
Yeah, I didn't expect to be doing a plug, but I'm Brad Lips with Atlas Network, and first of all, just very grateful to Dan and Joseph for putting together what I think is a really valuable tool. And yes, some of the independent think tanks that we work with all around the world are now using this to inform some of their work about what kind of policy priorities they should have to move in a direction that allows more freedom and how to make that case backed by empirical data. And Atlas Network welcomes grant applications, and then we partner with with Atlantic Council to award organizations that can carry out meaningful research and reform agenda work. So, yeah, atlasnetwork.org is the plug. If I can throw in my question, though, also one of the things I'm curious about is like getting a little more granular with the data. Are there indicators in your three big categories or sub-indicators that you're finding are more correlated with improvements on the prosperity side of the index? I'm wondering if there's a way to talk about the sample in general, or maybe I imagine that countries at different levels of development perhaps would benefit from prioritizing different parts of the sort of freedom spectrum. So any comments on that question?
Yeah, so the report is for the general audience. We're also working on the more academic paper where we will present some of those findings. In the video you saw, we presented the correlation between the Freedom Index and the different indicators from the Prosperity Index. And here we found perfect correlation on each one of them. So a freer country will be more rich, people will be more educated, people will live longer, the minority rights, they would perform better on all the components. What we did is it's a very good question on the freedom side, which is the policy side, what you can do as a country to get on the right path to prosperity. The question that we're investigating is the sequencing of reforms. So where do you start, what do you do first, and so on. We're doing more research on this, but the preliminary findings that we did is we tested every single one of the sub-indexes against prosperity, controlling for everything else. And when you do that, you find that the rule of law, the legal freedom, is the most strongly correlated with prosperity, I think at 0.8, closely followed by economic freedom. And then third comes political freedom. All of them positive relationship, all of them are important. Some are just have a stronger relation to the other one. But what's very important to remember is by far the strongest is the three of them together, right? If you have those three, it would lead you to a prosperous society. But this, might be a clue to the sequence of reforms. We're looking into this. I'll let you know when the paper is ready, because it's a huge endeavor, but I think there's some very fascinating research questions in there.
Yeah. Well, thank you. That's helpful flavor. Congrats again.
And we do have another question online from Mehdi Ascari. Apologies if I butchered your name. Can you please discuss the case of Saudi Arabia with a poor freedom index and a high prosperity? Which there's other countries, you'd mentioned Singapore and UAE, for instance, where there's that incongruity.
Yeah, I mean, again, it's the interesting question always in defining freedom and prosperity for our indexes is to step back from what people normally assume we are thinking of. So when you talk to people about freedom, the first thought is always political freedom. But when we talk about freedom, we think about economic freedom, political freedom, and legal freedom together. When we talk about prosperity, people very often think about GDP per capita, which is just a material prosperity. But we always think about it holistically at the other aspects. Saudi Arabia falls into a category which again is special, and we want to analyze these separately, which are countries very rich in natural resources, which are, as a result of that, rank very highly, have a very high GDP per capita because of that. And then countries like this also will have resources to have good education, for example, and good healthcare. But then they may not rank very well at minority rights, which we measure with religious freedom, for example. So it's something that we want to explore further, and not just for Saudi Arabia, but other countries that are in the same category.
Mm-hmm. And yes, audience.
Thank you. My name is Dr. Myrtle Alexander of Institute for Academic Management. I wanted to draw reference to the United States, which...
Can you speak louder, please?
Sorry. My name is Dr. Myrtle Alexander, Institute for Academic Management. I wanted to draw reference to the United States, where it ranks 20 and 21 on your indexes, and to find out what strategies and structures are missing as to why we're in the top 20 and just below the top 20. Given that education may be a determining factor, how can we improve as a nation to rise to the top?
So the United States.
Yeah. I want to apologize. I won't give you a good answer. And let me tell you why you won't get a very good answer. The aim of our work is to help the poor and the marginalized everywhere, but especially in developing countries. We have spent a lot less, actually very little, let me rephrase it, very little, on the United States, Canada, Western Europe, Japan, the countries that are free and prosperous. And we are much more interested in what tools we can give to people in government and outside government in developing countries. We have not spent much time on studying what happened in the United States. But I tell you what, please come by at the end. I'll give you my card. We will do a study just for you, and we'll give you the results. Very happy to do that. And it's good for us to spend time. The way I like to say it, I'm less interested in taking Bulgaria and making Belgium. I'm much more interested in taking a country that is doing poorly in the, is number 120, and take that country and bring it all the way up to 90. Mm. So we're not worrying about the countries that are 20, trying to make them 11. They are fine. Yeah.
We're fine for now. Yes, sir.
Hello, Andrei Larionov, Center for Security Policy. I have a couple of questions. First, a very small one concerning the figure 20 in your publication. You have mentioned that you have data for 164 countries, but in this figure you have only 77 observations. Could you explain why you have chosen substantially smaller number of observations for this particular figure compared to the whole database?
Yes. So this figure that you're referring to looks at the impact of changes in freedom and how these correlate with changes in prosperity. We did for the entire sample, and we found a similar positive relationship. What we did here is we took off the sample in the middle from the changes from -5 to +5, with the idea of these will be the noise to your signal, right? So these countries are not real movers. We just focused on those that actually did a strong move either in the positive direction or in the negative direction, sorry. But I guarantee you, actually in the text we mentioned it, we did the same analysis with the full sample, and the relationship holds. So,
so let me tell you the genesis of the chart. So what is very easy is to show correlation.
Yeah.
So the correlation for these 164 countries is 0.8. So it's very easy to show that countries that are free are also prosperous. And but this doesn't tell us much. As we know, correlation doesn't mean that there is causation. And we are interested in causation. We want to make the case that if you have freedom, you also have prosperity. So how do we do that? And what we tried to do was to say, let's look at countries where you had the most change in freedom, and let's see if later those same countries had the most change in prosperity. Mm-hmm. So there are very few methodological avenues for showing causation. And we have a wonderful team of experts, academics, who advise us, and they told us that this is one of the most reliable ones. So that's and then we said, let's look not at everybody, which we did that also, but let's look at those with the most change. Does that make sense?
Hello, my name is Alexander Tran. I'm an intern for the U.S. House of Representatives, just not too far down here. And I'd like to know, what are some prevalent political ideologies or maybe the causes?
I'm sorry, can you speak louder, please?
Oh, I'm sorry, yes. I just want to know, what are some prevalent ideologies, political ideologies specifically, that are common within the nations that are considered high prosperity but low freedom, that's commonly found amongst those?
Ideologies and
low freedom. Yeah, so look, there is always the temptation of making the case that an authoritarian leader can solve problems through decisions that are made quickly by this leader or a small group of people, and dispensing with all these niceties like elections and legislatures and consultations with the people and all that. And there is an extensive discussion about that, and usually people give the example of Singapore. And actually, we talked about it in our report last year. Singapore has done very well. Lee Kuan Yew, if you go to Kissinger's book on leadership, is one of the 6 great leaders in the 20th century that he mentioned. And he was in power influencing the affairs of Singapore in one capacity or another for 50 years. The 2 prime ministers that came afterwards were also excellent. So you can have a country that has wonderful leaders for an extended period of time, but you can also have a country that has a horrible leader for 50 years, followed by even worse leaders. So there is the temptation that you can have a great leader who will solve all your problems. Mussolini famously said, "I'll get the trains to run on time." Well, he did that, but they also got Italy into war, which destroyed the country. So the ideology exists, and we are not convinced by it, but that's usually what they are saying.
Thank you so much.
And we have time for one last question.
J.P. Hogan, I write about politics. On freedom and prosperity, I get the question then is, where is it property rights? And if you have a state-run economy, is your prosperity that the government's providing the quality of life? Or where is the difference between whether you own it or you have access to it? Where are you breaking down that line between the different? Is it freedom to own, or is it freedom of access?
So I have my cheat sheet here. So property rights is one of the 4 components of economic freedom. It is property rights including when we use Fraser, we use the Fraser Index for that. Property rights including over financial assets and are poorly defined and not protected by law. That's the lowest threshold. Or are clearly defined and well protected by law is the highest threshold. So it's a survey-based index where they ask experts whether property are well defined and protected by law.
Well, on that note, we are hitting our time mark here at 10:30. I want to thank Dan, Joseph, for this very insightful conversation. Thanking our audience, both in person and virtually, for joining us. And I do encourage you to go to visit Atlantic Council online so you can learn more about the Freedom and Prosperity Indexes. Thank you very much.